What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. I'm your host, Bill Brian Bafflestone. I have with me today my lovely assistant,
Adelina.
And today we are having another episode of my Deep Dive series, this time into Advanced Familiar Tactics. But first, I have a sponsor.
Today's episode will be brought to you by Cthulhu 2020. Why vote for the lesser evil?
Yeah, when it comes to choosing a tyrannical authoritarian overlord, go big or go home. So, Advanced Familiar Tactics. So Find Familiar is one of the most powerful and versatile spells in the game. Just as an example, a few weeks ago, my own character was knocked to 0 hit points. In most cases, a character is going to die in that scenario, but I have a familiar. So on my familiar's action, it was able to revive me with an 8-point good berry, and on my next action, I was able to cast a spell that completely flipped the battle and turned what was about to be a total party kill into a victory for the good guys. So that's the sort of impact that Find Familiar can have, but it is a very complicated spell that I think is difficult for players to leverage to its maximum advantage. So that's why we are going to take a deep dive today into Advanced Familiar Tactics. Before we begin, just a couple of notes.
Not covering Warlock familiars. It's going to be in a separate video.
Yeah, Warlocks through Pact of the Chain get access to Advanced Familiar options, which are very cool, but this is already going to be one of my longest videos, so I'm going to reserve discussion of Warlock familiars for a separate video.
We will deeply cover magic items for familiars also in a separate video.
Yeah, there are a lot of really good items that your familiar can use or attune to, but I want to give that a real in-depth look, so I'm going to do a deep dive on this in another video, and I'm just going to touch upon that ability in this video.
Anyone can have one. Feat, Ring of Spell Storing, or Arcane Abeyance.
Yeah, keep in mind that this is a spell available ostensibly only to wizards, but some other character classes do get access to the wizard spell list. For example, Eldritch Knights or Arcane Tricksters. And there are ways for any character to get this ability. You can take a wizard dip, you can use a feat to acquire it, you can use a Ring of Spell Storing, Arcane Abeyance. There are a number of ways in this game to acquire a familiar, even if you're not a wizard. And I do recommend doing so if you can, because familiars really are very helpful and powerful.
Description. First level ritual which summons Fey, Celestial, or Fiendish Spirit with variable form, or NPC initiating bond, DM discretion.
Yeah, so I put the description of the spell on the screen, and the first thing we need to point out is that it does not summon an actual animal. It summons a spirit that takes a celestial, fiendish, or fey attribute, but it's not a real animal, so you can cast it again to change its form, and if it dies, you can cast the spell again to resummon the exact same spirit. So go ahead and give it a name. It's not going to be weird. I do need to point out that there is another way to get familiars in the game. If you look at the monster manual, you will see that there are variant rules that are intended for NPCs only, but of course a DM can do whatever he likes. And in this scenario, your player actually encounters a real pseudo-dragon, quasit, or imp, and through role-playing, convince it to become your familiar. You can initiate the familiar bond, and it will even confer its magic resistance to the player. So that is very cool, but it is completely outside of the powers of the player. It's DM dependent, it's campaign dependent, you have no control over that. So for the rest of this analysis, I'm just going to be looking at the spell.
It can't attack, but can take any other action.
Yeah, it can't take the attack action, but there are a whole bunch of other really awesome actions that it can take, most notably the help action, the interact with object action, and the use magic item action.
100-foot telepathy. Talk to DM to determine parameters.
Yeah, so you can talk to your familiar through a telepathic link, but you need to talk to your DM to determine exactly what sort of information you can transmit. The monster manual does have rules for telepathy, but those rules require both creatures to know a language. The familiar doesn't know a language. So I think in this case, it makes more sense to look at the 8th level telepathy spell, which does work on creatures without a language, and specifies that you can communicate simple words and simple sensory impressions. Jeremy Crawford himself seems to adhere to this interpretation, but again, your DM is in control of your game. So have a conversation with him, talk and find out exactly what sort of information that your familiar can transmit to you through its telepathic link. Because we have to remember they have animal intelligence. They do not get an intelligence boost in 5th edition like they did in previous editions.
100-foot sense sharing is action, non-combat only.
This is pretty cool. You can use an action to look through the eyes of your familiar, and you will gain all of its special senses, such as blind sight. But keep in mind that when you do it, the effect ends at the beginning of your next turn. So you can't, for example, use your familiar's blind sight to see an invisible creature and then cast a spell on it, because by the time you can do so, you will no longer be looking through the senses of your familiar. However, in utility scenarios, it is extremely nice.
Dismissal. 30-foot teleport on resummon. No sight needed. Items dropped when dismissed or killed.
Yeah, so you can dismiss your familiar and then make it reappear anywhere within 30 feet. Rules as written, this does not require line of sight. So that's a pretty useful ability that I'm sure you can figure out how to leverage when the time comes. But one thing to remember is that whenever the familiar is dismissed or killed, it drops everything. So if you have your familiar attuned to magic items, or if your familiar is carrying expensive equipment, be aware. You don't want that thing to die, and you don't want to get too clever dismissing it because it's going to drop everything.
It can share touch spells.
Yeah, so this is the last thing that we should note from the description. It can share touch spells. It's a little complicated to coordinate if you're using it offensively because you go on different turns in the initiative order. But it can be very useful for your own party who's going to cooperate in terms of timing, and that way you can deliver touch heals and buffs and stuff. So, pretty nice ability. Now, the last thing we're going to do in terms of the description is look at some of the forms that the familiar can take.
Useful shapes. Owl. 60-foot fly, flyby attack.
Yeah, this is probably the most popular familiar form because most players are offensive-minded, and the owl is a fantastic offensive familiar because it has that flyby attack. So it can get right up next to an enemy and perform the help action or release a poison or something. And then it can fly away without incurring an opportunity attack because it has flyby. So that's really sweet. It's also got, great mobility, nice perception, really solid familiar. But because I am not an offensive-minded player, it's not my favorite. I have used this form in the past, but it is not my go-to.
Bat. 30-foot fly, 60-foot blind sight.
This is the one that I like. That 60-foot blind sight is a fantastic ability in regards to the terms of engagement, which is very important to me. So think about it. Any invisible creature that gets within 60 feet of me is going to be noticed by my familiar, who will alert me, and then I will know to cast See Invisibility. That's fantastic. And for me, the most powerful ability of all of the familiars, including some of these DM discretion ones that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Spider. Can be super tiny, spider climb, web sense.
If I need spying, I will sometimes change my familiar into spider form because spiders can be tiny, 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 like way tinier than any of the other familiar forms. So is unsurpassed in terms of slipping through cracks, slipping under doors, slipping through keyholes or whatever. It's also an extremely unobtrusive form. Not too many people are going to be suspicious of a spider climbing along the wall. It's got that climb, so it's very maneuverable. So I really think this is the best form for spying, and I will sometimes have my familiar take that form.
Octopus. Water-based, camouflage, ink cloud.
Yeah, sometimes you need to operate underwater. You're going to want your familiar alongside of you. So I think this one's pretty fantastic. Advantage on stealth rolls, free obscurement through the ink cloud, very solid.
Raven. 50-foot fly, mimicry. Can deliver messages at long distances.
Yeah, that mimicry thing can be used to deliver messages, hundreds of miles away if you want to devote your familiar to that. Personally, I feel like you can also just write stuff down and, have him carry the note. But it should be pointed out that you can use the Raven for that. Those are the only stock forms described in the player's handbook that I think are useful. The others, I think, are for flavor characters. But there are a few DM discretion familiars that can be very good.
Arctic Stink Squirrel, DM Discretion, Stinking Cloud.
Yeah, this one was introduced in the roll up to Tasha's, and it's really sweet, right? It's the first familiar that can cast a spell. DC 11 Stinking Cloud isn't hugely impressive, but even at the low DC, you're going to stick it on your enemies like 30 or 40% of the time. It will create heavy obscurement. And so for a character like myself that is optimized for obscurement, that's a really nice advantage. I have considered using this form. My DM has allowed it. But I already have a spell gem for my familiar. He will typically be using his concentration for other things. And I'm just not offensive minded. I'm not looking to stick a stinking cloud on my opponents when I have lots of other options for that regard. So I generally still prefer the bat because that blind sense is just amazeballs.
Tresson, DM Discretion, 40-foot fly, 11 intelligence, detect invisible, poison sense.
Yeah, so the Tressum is a flying cat introduced in one of the adventures. It's like Tomb of Annihilation or Storm King's Thunder. I forget which one. But it can be cool. I mean, it has a fly speed. That detect invisible is cool, although not as good as the blind sight of the bat. And 11 intelligence. That's really impressive. It's like by far the smartest of the familiars. So the Tressum can be a solid option if the DM allows it.
Flying Monkey, DM Discretion, 30-foot fly, hands if DM requires them.
So another optional familiar introduced in one of those adventures. And the flying monkey is very interesting because it has hands. If your DM is a real stickler for hands in order for your familiar to manipulate objects, then you might need the flying monkey. Personally, I feel like if an owl can, snatch a mouse off the ground on a 60-mile-per-hour drop, it's not going to have too much trouble manipulating a wand. And if a squirrel can run across my yard with a nut in its mouth, it's not going to have too much trouble carrying, a little potion or something. But, it's going to depend on your DM. So if your DM insists on hands, I would take the flying monkey. If my DM insisted on hands, I would absolutely 100% give up the blind sight of the bat in exchange for the hands of the flying monkey, because the way I use familiars, the ability to manipulate objects is absolutely critical.
Utility applications. Note, exposes familiar to attack. Mitigate with blessing of the trickster, sanctuary, invisible, etc.
Yeah, so now we are going to transition from looking at what the spell does and into ways that you can use the spell. And you can use the spell in either utility, offensive, or defensive applications. And we're going to briefly look at the utility applications. Be aware that this is going to expose your familiar to damage. So you may want to protect it with things like the sanctuary spell or invisibility or what have you. Because you don't want your familiar to die, and by exposing it, that is always a possibility.
Scouting and recon.
Yeah, so this is clearly the premier utility use of familiars. They can scout for you. If you have a tiny, unobtrusive creature, it can just enter a room and then you can look through its senses. Or if it's a flying creature, it can fly straight up and give you a really nice aerial reconnaissance view of the surrounding area. So really fantastic way to use your familiar.
Guarding. High passive perception.
Yeah, so familiars don't need to sleep. You can use them in guard protocols. Some of them have a really nice passive perception, like the owl has an 18, the Tressum has a 20, I believe. So really useful for your guard protocols.
Triggering traps.
Yeah, so remember your familiar is expendable. It's a totally renewable resource, except for the hour and 10 minutes it takes to summon it as a ritual. So if there is a trap or any kind of hazard that you need a sacrifice for, your familiar can be that sacrifice and you're not going to lose anything.
Messaging.
Yeah, so you can send your familiar really far away. You can send a message through mimicry if you use a raven, or you can write messages down and, send messages in that fashion.
Interactive object. Doors, buttons, levers, genie vessel, rope trick.
Yeah, so you can use the familiar to manipulate various, objects on the field. If you have the new Genie Warlock power, you can have your familiar run around with your vessel. And one of the ways that I use it is when I cast Rope Trick. So if I'm in my rope trick and the rope is pulled up, what I'll do is I'll use my interact with object to lower the rope, then my movement to climb down the rope, and then my action to cast a spell or something, then climb back up the rope, and then my familiar will use his interact with object to pull the rope back up. All in one round. It's very elegant and effective.
Use magic items. Helm of Telepathy, Ring of Invisibility, Weapon of Warning.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really cool items that your familiar can use or attune to that's going to really give it an advantage on the utility side of things. And again, I'm going to go into that in a separate video.
Offensive applications. Note, exposes familiar to attack. Mitigate with cover, backpack, sanctuary, invisible.
Yeah, so you can use your familiar for offense, but be aware that if it is having a large impact on the battle, your enemies are going to have a real interest in killing that thing. And it's pretty easy to kill a familiar, so be careful using it for offense. That said, if you are careful, there are a lot of very helpful things that it can do.
Cast Stinking Cloud.
Yeah, I mean, if it's an Arctic stink squirrel, you can cast Stinking Cloud. That's a really nice offense and defense both because it provides obscurement.
Deliver touch attacks. Classic Shocking Grasp.
Yeah, like I said, you can do it. It's difficult to coordinate, but it can be done. The shock and grass thing is the classic, but man, I don't understand why you would do that in 5th edition. Just take a ranged cantrip. Jeez.
Dragon's Breath combo.
This is a really nice way to spend your concentration at levels 3 or 4. Dragon's Breath is a bonus action, so you can cast it and still do something useful with your action, like cast a cantrip like Minor Illusion, or do the hide action or some such, and it turns your familiar into a weapon platform. This is totally legal as per the sage advice that I put on the screen. Releasing the Dragon's Breath is not an attack, so it can provide a little bit of extra damage on every round with its own action. That's really nice at levels 3 and 4.
Help action. Only owl form is truly viable due to flyby attack.
Yeah, so you can use your familiar to deliver the help action, but it does need to be right next to that creature, so it's going to incur an opportunity attack if it leaves, unless you have the owl. So this is one of the nice reasons to have the owl. That flyby attack allows it to give the help action with impunity. This is one of the most popular uses of the familiar.
Satisfy condition for sneak attack.
This is another one that people like to use. Rogues, if they have an ally next to their target, can gain their sneak attack advantage. So that's pretty nice.
Interactive object. Catapult. Move dropped items or objects. Thrown, command, fear, etc. Apply inhaled poison. Apply manacles. Drop caltrops, ball bearings, or oil.
Yeah, so there's a lot of offensive things that you can do with your familiars. Interact with object. Inhaled poisons, I think, are one of the best because it's not an attack, so your familiar can deliver them. But there are all sorts of things that it can do on the field, such as, return thrown objects to you. If you force someone to drop something, it can take those objects off of the field. I mean, really nice ways to gain a slight advantage through your familiar. Just, again, be aware it's going to be exposed to attack.
Use magic items. Ring of spell storing, ring of shooting stars, wands. Discuss about hands.
Yeah, there's a lot of good items that your familiar can use or attune to that will burnish its offensive capabilities. Just discuss with your DM about the hands thing. I mean, you might need hands to use a wand. But, personally, I think that you're not going to have much of an issue with that. Rules as written, you can do things with actions and creatures can take actions, but talk to your DM.
Defensive applications. Note, can stay in backpack for total safety.
So this is how I like to leverage my familiar. I'm a defensive-oriented player, and I love the additional defense that having a familiar can bring. Plus, this method does not expose it to attack. As long as it's in the backpack, it has total perfect cover. It cannot be targeted with attacks, spells, or spell effects, and is only briefly vulnerable in the moment that it pops out to apply something to you. And in that case, someone who has a readied action might be able to pick it off. But for the most part, as a defensive utility, or as a defensive option, your familiar is not going to be in danger.
Deliver touch healing and buffs.
So that's one thing that you can use your familiar for, is to deliver, positive spell effects to your colleagues, because they can coordinate in the initiative order, and it can do all sorts of cool things to help you out.
Use magic items. Dust of Disappearance, Ever Smoking Bottle, Cube of Force.
Yeah, so again, a bunch of magic items that you can use or your familiar can attune to burnish its defensive capabilities, but we will cover those more deeply in a separate video.
Interactive object. Potions of Healing.
This is how I prefer to use my familiar, as a platform to use its interact with object to apply conditions or benefits to me without having to sacrifice any of my own action economy. I have plenty of potions of healing available for my familiar, and it can use this action to apply them every round. In combat, this functions as a quasi-regeneration and is an absolutely fantastic way to use your familiar.
Good berries. DM discretion.
So good berries are something similar to potions of healing that you can use. If you have a life cleric in the party, they can create extremely powerful ones. But I do need to point out that rules as written, it doesn't specify that a person or a creature can use this action to apply it to another creature. You need to talk to your DM about that. You can do so with potions of healing. So it seems to me that it's, not much of a stretch to think that you can do the same with good berries. But again, talk to your DM.
Potions. Kiotum's Ointment, Resistance, Giant Strength, Growth, Diminution, Invisibility.
Yeah, there are a lot of other potions in this game besides potions of healing. And I'm going to be perfectly honest. I have all of these. Like Batman's utility belt got nothing on my backpack and, my familiar's options. I have every single one of all 10 potions of resistance, which can be very helpful if I'm ever facing any kind of consistent energy damage. I'm going to be resistant to it on the next round. I use potions of Hill Giant Strength in case I might have to escape a grapple or something. I have potions of Growth in case I want to be like a gargantuan ape with polymorph, or I'm a small creature, so I might need to take one of these to become medium, so I can then use Dimension Door on an ally. Diminution can be interesting because as a small creature, I drink one of these. I'm now 10 pounds and tiny, so I can hide in my opponent or my colleague's backpack if I want. Invisibility is amazing. Now, these are very rare items, but if you can get it applied by your familiar, you lose no actions and no concentration to be invisible. These are all really powerful abilities that your familiar can confer to you in a defensive scenario that I think are just absolutely fantastic.
Antitoxin.
Antitoxin, it's cheap, and you can usually find time at the beginning of the battle for your familiar to apply this, and you never know when someone's going to drop a cloud kill on you. When that happens, you are going to want to have taken an antitoxin.
Perfume of Bewitching.
Another nice common one, 50 gold, advantage on interactions, pretty sweet.
Earplugs.
Some effects in this game require hearing. For example, the Chasme has a drone effect. If you pop in earplugs, you are protected.
Holy water.
There are some things that you require holy water for. Again, the Chasme's drone effect, if it sticks, you're going to need a splash of holy water to be revived. So that's why I have it available for my familiar.
Black sap.
Black sap is a rare one, but it's quite powerful in that it can remove the charmed or frightened condition in exchange for a constitution saving throw against being poisoned. Even if the poison sticks, that's way better than being charmed or frightened. Charmed especially is an extremely powerful condition that normally requires greater restoration to remove. So to have the ability to remove it through your familiar is really fantastic.
Willow Shade Oil.
And finally, Willow Shade Oil. This is another rare equipment that's only 30 gold and can reverse petrification if applied within 1 minute. I have never used Willow Shade Oil, but I really want to, because just imagine like a Medusa sticks you with the flesh to stone effect, or a wizard sticks you with a flesh to stone effect, and you're like, ah! And then all of a sudden, it reverses because your familiar has applied Willow Shade Oil and the petrification goes away, and you can be all like, did you really think that was going to work? Oh, great moment. So I think that's it, right, darling?
Yep, that's all.
So that's my analysis of Find Familiar and some advanced familiar tactics that you can take to really maximize the power of your familiar. But please let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. Please let me know of any other cool ways that you've thought of to use your familiar. And in any case, thank you so much for watching. This has been the Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. I'm your host, Bill Brian Bafflestone.
And I am his lovely assistant, Adelina. See you next time.